Okay, welcome back. We're in part three of the lecture now on figures of youth. So now we'll be talking about risky figures and youth studies figures specifically. So risky figures, Steve.
Yeah, so in this kind of figure, I compare the construction of two versions of young people through the concept of risk. There's the at-risk youth, the homeless youth person, the drug taker, the one that may be kind of open to um, violence or things like that. The kind of a lot of the what we call the sector is around, helping and protecting youth work, intervening into young people's lives and helping them like that. Very important. It's kind of a lot of our research speaks into that to try and help with, making good policy, helping hopefully that, the sector's well informed and um, working with young people in a way that's productive for their lives. And then there's like the risk-taking youth, yeah, which is like, again, that speaks to that kind of more developmental understanding of young people that they're kind of, their brains are kind of apparently, risky putty that hasn't developed into kind of its full self yet, and like they're more prone to making bad decisions and taking risks and stuff like that. And
Mm.
so kind of play those figures off a little bit because I suppose they're the most prominent in research um, when you're actually um, doing research with young people, which is like what we like to say we do in our center. We're kind of not trying to do research on them, we're doing research with them. But inevitably, I think we still bring aspects of these kind of figures into our work. It's unavoidable in some ways. You can't really do research that sketches out the full life of a person. We're only ever really dealing with a compartmentalized part of their lives and what they report to us and what we can observe. Um, Inevitably, that means even our research questions are often done through these lenses in one way or another. I mean, the work we're doing on fintech and financial practices at the moment, I think, still repeats some of this in some ways, but that's because we want young people to have good, secure lives, and at the moment they don't in many ways. And um, so, we see them sometimes as taking, we've been doing interviews, Julia, where we've been like saying young people have told us about some silly risks they've taken and lost a lot of money, or other times they're more prudent and doing things correctly. And even though those ones that are doing things correctly sometimes can't get it all together, right? Because
Mm.
cost of living so high and wages are so low. So inevitably, I think we bring aspects of these things into our work. I don't think that necessarily has to be a total problem for what we do, but I think we have to be conscious of it and to ensure that we're not ourselves relying upon stereotypes for the research projects and questions that we do, or worse, reproduce those stereotypes in the
Mm.
way that we write these things up. So
Yeah.
again, here very much um, owe Peter Kelly's work for the at-risk youth thing here. That's pretty much what I'm outlining there is very much what Peter Kelly was writing about for much of his career. And the risk-taking one, yeah, there's that kind of brain in the jar kind of model that
Mm.
we, I think, as kind of youth sociologists, are quite critical against. Again, we're not saying that like young people's brains aren't developing. Um, it's just that the kind of prognosis of that, the diagnosis of that, of what it means for young people's lives, I
Mm.
think is a problem. And
Mm.
again, I think I've kind of said in a quip before that like I see a lot of very irresponsible adults as well. Like, but young people seem to be positioned as irresponsible in ways that adults aren't as much. And I
Mm.
think it's the model that much youth studies has been writing against in that sense, these two, with and for throughout the 30 or 40 years that it's existed.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree. The the main sort of point or perspective here is about looking at the conditions of young people's lives as being paramount
Mm,
because the at-risk framing and the kind of neurological developmental models are very, I guess, comforting and useful for simplifying and creating an objective study that you can put in a box and you can say definitive things about.
mm,
And obviously we need some of those boxes. Obviously, when we're trying to create policy or we're trying to have large scale understandings of, yeah. what things might help young people flourish, for example. But I guess the downsides or the inevitable things that can happen with those putting things in boxes, creating categories, and then creating labels, like we talked about last week as well, is that it can be just vastly, you know, not complex enough for being able to understand what's actually going on and all of the other things that might be just as relevant. So I've got a really kind of pet hate with the brain in a jar or the neurological developmental perspectives. I think they're particularly on the rise at the moment. We talk a lot in our work together, Steve, about the sort of rise of eugenics or the
Mm.
rise of kind of biological explanations for
Yeah,
behavior. Science loves that because it's so simple, right? To just be like, oh, they've taken this risk because their prefrontal cortex isn't developed. Like that's become a real kind of popular culture
yeah,
line that I hear even more since you wrote this paper, I reckon.
mm.
It's so comforting to have those kind of biological, neurological, developmental models that explain behavior and explain why people do things. But unfortunately, it's so much more than that. It's that and the fact that wealth inequality has never been greater.
Mm.
That and the precarity of young people's lives as a generation now. So I think often it's the kind of look over here that is
Yeah,
the dominant framing, really, of young people that that last point makes. Public perception is that this is just what young people are. We don't need to look at the rest.
yeah, yeah. It's right. It's very correct. I think to align this kind of neurological model with the eugenesis thing that's increasingly dominating public discourse for sure. I mean, another good example here to kind of think through is the social media ban and the way that the book The Anxious Generation has just
Mm,
kind of dominated public discourse about that. It's a terrible book.
mm,
Um, it's got huge holes in it. If anyone's interested in a kind of quick takedown of it, listen to the If Books Could Kill podcast about that book.
mm,
Um, what's really interesting about that podcast is that the authors kind of want to believe the argument of the book,
mm.
because they're kind of middle-aged people now themselves and want to kind of have this one-stop fix of young people's lives. But the book is so bad that even those they can't really bring themselves to kind of allow the arguments to happen because they're so bad.
Yeah.
That book's a good example of like someone that kind of plotted a graph that like the phone was invented here and like anxiety's apparently gone up and therefore it's the phones. Like nothing to
Mm,
do with everything else in the world, climate change, fascism, cost of living. Like young people experience these things in their day-to-day lives and
mm.
um, obviously has a real effect um, on their mindset. So
Yeah.
yeah, that risk taking youth there is again present in all those kind of public debates about the social media ban. What wasn't present was actual real research with young people about how they use social media. The
Mm.
vast majority of which use it in all kinds of like often sensible ways, in ways
Protective
where they kind of
ways.
find each other, particularly marginalized youth, find other marginalized youth on there and have create communities and scenes and groups. Um, so the moral panic imperative about kind of getting social media out of young people's lives as some kind of panacea to their social problems is frankly just an absurd proposition.
Mm.
But here we are. And
Yeah.
I think it's a really good example of how these kind of discourses distort the reality of what needs to be done.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's easy.
If only it was so easy, right?
Mm. Yeah,
I
yeah,
wish. I wish
yeah.
we could ban phones in schools or ban social media and all of young people's problems would be
Mm.
solved.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, that's not the case.
yeah.
So now we've got some other sort of, I guess, academic figures or how these figures are used within scholarly work to
Mm.
try to, I guess, do some of the disrupting work we've been talking about um,
Yeah.
with
I
the
mean, so I was
framing.
involved in some of these debates earlier on in my career about like class and generations or class and reflexivity and these kind of different things that we kind of use to analyze young people's lives. Um, so generations in particular has been a kind of controversial concept in our field. It's useful in some ways, useless in others. Again, you just need to kind of contextualize it in a way that is useful. The idea that kind of all young people of a particular age, all people of a particular age are going to share all these kind of characteristics is kind of absurd, right? But they also will have kind of similar um, experiences and attitudes towards things based on, you know, time and place. So you need to kind of use a thing like that with care. But like generations are kind of seems to be the generational relations are key drivers of moral panics, which well we've been looking at throughout this
Mm.
discussion, and those relations matter in that sense. On the other side of things, you know, within our field, I think there's been some excellent work done through this figurative lens. Maybe at the time the authors weren't like talking about this as kind of figurative work, but I think if I want to reverse engineer and categorize it in a way, they kind of are. The classic, I think, being Anita Harris's great work on the can-do and at-risk girl that I've been very much influenced by my own work. We've used the idea of the gorilla self in our work. We use it in the Hustle project. I've done stuff around hipsters and bogans. Akane Kanai's really interesting stuff about relatability and the different ways that young women, in particular, on online cultures, have these different kind of categorical, figurative things that they use to communicate with each other around the best friend, the boyfriend, the hot guy, and creeps. I think it was really interesting work. I think students would really like that if they checked it out. So I think we can do generative, creative work by um, using this figurative lens. And again, it's not about putting things in boxes or categories. It's more about like understanding how much of the way that we communicate is kind of often through these figurative, stereotypical ways anyway. And so we actually need to draw out those things as much as possible to get a kind of real understanding of what's going on in any particular kind of social circumstance. So
Yeah.
that's where these kind of play off against each other's. Like within youth studies, there's been this kind of figurative work done, and I just want to make it more explicit, less implicit, I suppose.
Mm. Yeah. So if figures of youth as an approach is about focusing attention on the conditions of young people's lives and the ways that they change over time and in relation to social and cultural formations, including power, then that means that while we can identify a figure, it's not putting it the same thing as putting it in a box to
Mm,
as a problem to solve or a sort of objective thing to know. It's about illustrating like a dynamic that's not just a stereotype, but that's much more fluid and kind of um, a much more in-depth way to look at what is going on in a way that is not solely sort of extending all action and the kind of locus of attention isn't just about like what a young person's brain is doing or
mm,
developmentally whether they're hitting their markers or whatever. It's about well, like putting the young person in the whole context as much as is possible, which is really it's hard to do any of this kind of stuff holistically, but this is certainly an approach to look at the everything else that is going on in a way
yeah.
that makes sense instead of just being like, oh, well, it's complicated or oh, it's society. It's more than a hand wave kind of thing. It's
Mm,
a much more useful set of um, tools, I guess, I would say.
yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And so yeah. So like to kind of sum it up really, like the paper that I wrote, I was hoping would be taken as a generous critique of what was going on. It's not like it's not meant to be one of these papers that's kind of critiquing everything and saying this is all bad and we need to start doing this in this way. It's not really the motivation for it at all. It was just, I suppose, to help, um, yeah, formulate a broader understanding of the different ways that youth or young person is, yeah, brought into being in the work that we do, whether we like it or not, or whether we mean to or not. And if we're not cognizant of the different ways that we do this, it's very likely that we'll not be creating a kind of, you know, a research culture or influence of our research, combining with other, you know, sectors, policy, youth work, or whatever, in a productive way, because it's likely that we're doing it in two different ways, or not
Mhm.
speaking to each, not being able to have a proper conversation about it.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah. Um, and just to touch upon what you said there, it's not just a way of saying that like shit is complex. You know what I mean? Like that's an easy thing to put out. I want it to be
I love saying shit's complex, by the way. It's like my
yeah,
favorite.
yeah.
Think so.
So it is, things are complex. They're always a bit more complex than probably we want them to be, or than the way we explain things. But I'm hoping that this kind of, what's essentially a method really, is to
Mm,
like help us have a lens to see some of that complexity, but not like get stuck on the complexity, just to understand how things interrelate, and how those relations together mean that we have to ensure that we're talking about the same thing.
mm. Yeah, and even like it might be interesting for you to think about like students in the course, like what what is being summoned when young people are being discussed? Like when you hear like, oh, young people today, young people are like this, like or in the headlines or just kind of in the
Mm.
day-to-day conversations, probably that older people will be saying, I would suggest. But like what is being done? Like what are they trying to kind of conjure? Are they trying to
Yeah,
conjure like someone who's irresponsible? They're trying to conjure someone who needs protection, who is you know, things are happening to them by no fault of their own through, you know, cost of living crisis or, you know, any of the above. But when you're asking those questions, you're thinking about really what figure of youth
Mm.
is being conjured in that setting.
Yeah, and it might be more than one. So that's
Mm,
right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the interesting thing about that is, like, I had Barney Langford, who was a PhD student of mine in his 60s, and he was kind of very interested in this kind of stuff, and he found like 16-year-olds, kind of doing the denigrating thing of like 6-year-olds today. Like, back when I was a 6-year-old, I never had an iPad. So it just seems to be this kind of thing that we do as we get older, and to be, I think, yeah, to be trying to wary of that, to wary of, because I think it speaks to a particular kind of conservative form of power that's a problem. That's, so I think that's very much what these figures are helpful to kind of draw out the different
mm.
political relations of these things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this paper has been really influential in not just in youth studies, but it's been cited across sociology and other social sciences, criminology, um, to basically try to understand the conditions of young people's lives. And we'll take a look in a later week at another article that has drawn on this one heavily to theorize how youth crime is kind of created as a moral panic using this figurative approach. And it's a really great that's a really great paper too. And it's good to see how it's being put to work in exactly the way that you intended it, Steve, which is
Yeah.
a rare privilege and like pleasure, I would guess, as
Yeah.
as an academic to see actually an idea being used in a way that I know you would agree with the way that you.
Yeah, no, it's been nice to see a couple of people using this as a model to kind of, and a lens for their own work. And yeah, a couple of people that I really like their research as well, and have been using it. So yeah, it's a good thing to see.
Yeah,
Yep.
great. Well, thanks for joining us, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks.